The boardroom doors swung open, and the heavy silence of the room wrapped around me. I walked in wearing a sharp emerald green silk suit and sat confidently at the head of the long glass table. My younger sister Jasmine, the undeniable golden child of our family, who was accustomed to having the world handed to her on a silver platter, walked in a moment later. She opened her mouth ready to call me a failure just like she always did, but the insult caught in her throat. Her eyes locked onto the solid brass nameplate resting right in front of me. It read, "Nia Chief Executive Officer." Her face drained of all color and she actually started to tremble. But to understand how I ended up owning the very company that was about to completely dismantle her life of privilege, you have to go back 7 years. Back to the day my parents blocked my bedroom door and tried to trap me in a life I never chose. Hello, my name is Nia and I am 32 years old. If you have ever been the invisible child in your family treated like a stepping stone so your favorite sibling could shine, hit that like button and subscribe. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Stick around because the way I took back my power and tore down their perfect little world is going to leave you absolutely speechless. 7 years ago, my life was a constant uphill battle for basic human respect. I was 25 and living back home in our house in suburban Atlanta. My parents, Marcus and Denise, were completely obsessed with appearances and social climbing. To them, success was measured entirely by who you married and how much wealth you could show off to the neighbors. And in their eyes, Jasmine had achieved ultimate perfection. Jasmine was loud, beautiful, and profoundly spoiled. She had recently married Trevor, a white investment banker from a highly affluent family. Trevor carried himself with a quiet arrogance and a deep sense of privilege that he wore like a tailored suit. My parents absolutely worshipped him. They believed Trevor was our family's golden ticket to elite society. Meanwhile, I was just Nia, the quiet and hardworking daughter trying desperately to build a career in public relations. It was a Tuesday morning, the most important day of my professional life. I had landed a final round interview for a senior communications role at a top-tier firm in New York City. This was my ticket out of Atlanta, and my ultimate chance to prove my worth. I had spent weeks preparing and scraping together enough money to buy a professional charcoal gray suit. I woke up at 5 in the morning, meticulously ironing my shirt and running through interview questions in the mirror. I felt ready and powerful. But in my household, my ambitions were always treated as an inconvenience. While I was fixing my hair, I heard loud voices echoing from downstairs. Jasmine and Trevor had arrived completely unannounced. Trevor had surprised Jasmine with VIP tickets for a luxury ski trip to Aspen, and they were leaving that very morning. The problem was that they had not bothered to hire a nanny for their 2 toddlers. Why would they pay for a professional when they had me, the invisible sister, living right there under my parents' roof? I walked down the stairs with my briefcase in hand, ready to head to the airport for my flight to New York. My mother Denise saw me and immediately frowned. She looked me up and down, taking in my professional suit, and crossed her arms. She demanded to know where I thought I was going. I told her I had my final interview in New York, the one I had been talking about for an entire month. The one that could change my life forever. My father, Marcus, stepped out of the kitchen holding one of Jasmine's crying children. He looked at me with total disdain and told me I was not going anywhere. He said Trevor bought my sister a beautiful vacation and they needed a break. He ordered me to stay right there and watch my niece and nephew. I stared at them, completely stunned. I explained that my flight was leaving in 2 hours and that this job was my entire future. Trevor just stood by the front door checking his expensive watch, looking completely bored by my pleading. He let out a heavy sigh and told me not to be so selfish. He called my career a foolish little dream and said he was sure the company could reschedule. Selfish. The word echoed in my mind. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself so Jasmine could take the spotlight. And now, on the brink of my own success, they wanted me to cancel my future so she could go skiing. I tightened my grip on my briefcase, looked them dead in the eye, and told them absolutely not. The silence that followed was deafening. Jasmine gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, as if I had just physically struck her. Trevor actually laughed, a harsh and mocking sound that echoed in the high ceiling of the foyer. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath about how people like me never understand the value of family loyalty. But it was my mother who reacted with true venom. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute outrage. "How dare you speak to your sister and your brother-in-law that way?" she shrieked. She marched up the stairs, closing the distance between us in seconds. Before I could even brace myself, she grabbed my arm with a grip so tight her nails dug into my skin. She physically shoved me backward, forcing me to retreat into my bedroom. My father followed right behind her, his face stern and unyielding. He was carrying Jasmine's 2 screaming toddlers. Without a single ounce of hesitation, he tossed the crying children directly onto my neatly made bed, right on top of my freshly printed resumes and my professional portfolio. The papers crumpled beneath their weight. My mother stepped into the doorway and blocked my only exit. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You listen to me, Nia," she commanded, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. "Jasmine married into a wealthy white family. She married a man who brings real prestige to this house. She is elevating our social standing. Her marriage must be protected at all costs. You are just going to an interview for some low-level corporate job that you probably will not even get. Your sister comes first. She has always come first. You will stay right here in this house, and you will babysit these children so your sister can enjoy her vacation." I stared at the two people who were supposed to be my protectors. They were actively sabotaging my only chance at a real career just so their golden child could go drink champagne on a snowy mountain. I tried to step forward, but my father moved to block the frame completely. He looked at me with a coldness that froze the blood in my veins. "You are acting like an ungrateful child," Marcus said, his tone dripping with disappointment. "We put a roof over your head. The least you can do is help your sister maintain her lifestyle. If you walk out of this house today, you are no longer welcome back." My mother grabbed the heavy brass handle of my bedroom door. "You will stay in this room and do your duty to this family," Denise sneered. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut. A second later, I heard the distinct click of the exterior lock. They had actually locked me inside my own room. I stood frozen in the center of the bedroom, listening to the sound of my parents walking back down the stairs, apologizing profusely to Trevor for my supposed bad behavior. I heard the front door open and the cheerful goodbyes as they sent Jasmine and Trevor off to the airport. On my bed, the two toddlers were screaming and throwing my crushed portfolio across the mattress. I looked at the clock on my wall. I had exactly 90 minutes before my flight began boarding. If I missed this plane, my career in New York was over before it even started. I would be stuck in Atlanta forever, trapped as the permanent babysitter and the invisible backbone for a family that completely despised me. I took a deep breath and let the reality of the situation wash over me. I was not going to cry. I was not going to beg them to open the door. I was going to save myself. I walked over to the bed and gently moved the children aside, making sure they were safe and secure on the soft mattress. I gathered the few unwrinkled copies of my resume and shoved them into my leather briefcase. I walked over to the second-story window and looked down. It was a 15-foot drop to the garden below. My charcoal gray pencil skirt was too tight for climbing. Without a second thought, I grabbed the hem of the skirt and ripped the seam straight up to my thigh. The fabric tore with a loud ripping sound, but I finally had a full range of motion. I threw my window open and felt the crisp morning air hit my face. I tossed my briefcase down first, aiming for the soft bushes below. Then I climbed onto the windowsill. I grabbed onto the sturdy metal drain pipe attached to the side of the brick house. My palms scraped against the rough exterior, but I did not care. I shimmied down the pipe, my expensive heels slipping against the brick wall. When I was a few feet from the ground, I let go and dropped into the damp soil of my mother's prized rose garden. I snatched my briefcase from the bushes, brushed the dirt off my blazer, and ran. I sprinted through the backyard, hopped over the wooden fence, and did not stop running until I was 3 streets away from my parents' house. I hid behind a large oak tree in the neighborhood park and pulled out my phone to order an Uber. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. As I sat in the back of the car, watching the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood blur past the window, my phone began to vibrate violently. The notifications lit up my screen one after another. My mother had obviously gone back upstairs to check on the kids and found the empty room. The text messages were a barrage of pure hatred. "You are a disgusting excuse for a daughter," Denise wrote. "How could you abandon your niece and nephew? You are a disgrace to this family," Marcus added. "Do not ever bother coming back to this house. You are dead to us." Jasmine chimed in from the airport lounge, sending a message that read, "You are completely pathetic, Nia. You are just jealous of my life and my husband. Enjoy your miserable little existence." I read every single word. I absorbed their venom and their entitlement. And then I smiled. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I did not type a single word in response. I did not defend myself or explain my actions. I simply blocked their numbers, deleted their contact information, and turned off my phone. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of the airport terminal, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I boarded my flight to New York City, and as the plane lifted off the runway, leaving Atlanta far behind, I made a silent vow. I was never going to be the victim again. I was going to build an empire so massive and so powerful that one day they would all have to look up just to see me. The first few years in New York City were a brutal test of my endurance. I had aced that interview and secured the job, but living in one of the most expensive cities in the world, on a junior specialist salary was a nightmare. I rented a tiny windowless room in a cramped apartment shared with 3 other people. I survived on cheap instant noodles and whatever leftover catering I could scavenge from corporate meetings. I worked my demanding corporate job from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Then I would rush to a local diner to work a shift as a waitress until midnight. On weekends, I did freelance copywriting just to keep the lights on. It was exhausting and lonely. There were nights when my entire body ached from standing and my bank account was completely overdrawn. I would sit on my mattress in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. Through mutual connections on social media, I would see the glamorous life my family was living back in Atlanta. Jasmine was constantly posting pictures of her lavish lifestyle. Photos of her wearing designer clothes, sipping expensive cocktails in VIP lounges, and bragging about her perfect marriage to Trevor. My parents were always in the comment sections praising her, calling her their greatest blessing. They posted professional family portraits where everyone was smiling, looking like the ultimate picture of success. I had been completely erased from their history. It was as if I had never existed at all. But I did not let their happiness break me. Instead, I used it as fuel. Every time I saw Jasmine flaunting her wealth, I worked another hour. Every time I saw my parents praising Trevor, I pitched another client. During my time at the corporate firm, I began to notice a massive flaw in how elite companies handled public relations disasters. When wealthy executives or massive corporations faced a scandal, their traditional PR teams were entirely too slow and too soft. They cared about issuing polite apologies when they should have been going on the offensive. I knew how to handle toxic people. I had been trained by the absolute best manipulators in the business, my own family. I understood how to control a narrative, how to flip a script, and how to bury a threat before it ever saw the light of day. I started taking on private consulting clients outside of my regular working hours. I offered ruthless, aggressive crisis management for high-profile individuals who were on the brink of losing everything. I did not write polite press releases. I restructured their entire corporate identity. I found their enemies' weak points and exploited them. I saved a billionaire CEO from a devastating embezzlement scandal by shifting the narrative and restructuring his board of directors overnight. Word of my specific brand of ruthless efficiency spread through the elite circles of the East Coast like wildfire. They started calling me the crisis fixer. By my 28th birthday, I quit my corporate job and officially launched Apex Vanguard. We were not just a public relations firm. We were a corporate restructuring and crisis management empire. We swallowed failing companies, neutralized toxic executives, and rebuilt corporate giants from the ashes. I hired the smartest, most aggressive lawyers and analysts in New York. Within 4 years, Apex Vanguard was pulling in tens of millions in revenue. I traded my torn pencil skirts for custom-tailored silk suits. I moved out of that windowless room and bought a stunning penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. I was no longer the invisible sister. I was a self-made millionaire, a corporate titan who could make or break a company with a single phone call. And then 7 years after I climbed out of that bedroom window, the ultimate opportunity dropped right onto my desk. I was sitting in my corner office sipping a black coffee when my lead financial analyst walked in and handed me a confidential intelligence report. My company regularly monitored failing investment funds and vulnerable corporations looking for lucrative acquisition targets. But the names on this specific report made my heart skip a beat. The document detailed the impending collapse of a major venture capital fund based in Atlanta. The fund was hemorrhaging money due to massive internal fraud and illegal wire transfers. The vice president of that failing fund was none other than my arrogant brother-in-law, Trevor. And it got better. To cover up his massive financial crimes, Trevor had been illegally funneling money through a corporate communications department at a separate financial firm. The director of that communications department, who was blindly signing off on these fraudulent transfers, was my sister Jasmine. The board of directors at Jasmine's firm had caught wind of the missing funds. They were absolutely panicked. They knew a federal investigation would destroy their entire company. So they did what panicked corporations always do. They voted to hire the most ruthless crisis management firm on the East Coast to come and clean house, fire the guilty parties, and restructure the company before the authorities found out. They reached out to Apex Vanguard. I sat in my leather chair reading the report, detailing the absolute destruction of my family's fake perfect life. Trevor was a criminal. Jasmine was his clueless accomplice, and their entire house of cards was about to burn to the ground. The board of directors in Atlanta was offering Apex Vanguard a massive contract and a controlling voting share in the company if we could save them from the fallout. I picked up my gold fountain pen, signed my name on the acquisition contract, and smiled. I pressed the button on my intercom and called my assistant. I told her to book a private jet to Atlanta. It was finally time to go home. The private jet touched down in Atlanta, just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city that had once been my prison. I sat in the back of the Maybach my assistant had arranged, watching the familiar skyline roll by. 7 years ago, I fled this city in a torn skirt with absolutely nothing but a crushed portfolio and a desperate dream. Now I was returning as the majority voting shareholder of the very company that employed my golden child sister. I pulled up the schedule my intelligence team had compiled. My family was highly predictable. Every Friday afternoon they gathered at an exclusive rooftop cafe in Buckhead to drink imported tea and loudly brag about their supposed wealth to anyone who would listen. I tapped the privacy glass and told my driver exactly where to go. The cafe was an obnoxious display of new money and false prestige. From the moment I stepped out of the car, the valet drivers scrambled to open the heavy glass doors for me. I was wearing a pristine white tailored suit that cost more than my parents' first mortgage. As I walked onto the crowded outdoor terrace, I spotted them immediately. They were sitting at a premium corner table. Jasmine was draped in flashy designer logos, holding a luxury handbag that I knew for a fact was purchased with stolen corporate funds. Trevor sat beside her, looking incredibly smug, gesturing widely as he spoke. My parents, Marcus and Denise, were leaning in, hanging on to his every word, as if he were a prophet. I walked slowly toward their table. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the marble floor seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Jasmine was the first one to notice me. Her obnoxious laughter died in her throat, and her eyes widened in absolute shock. She nudged Trevor, who turned around with a scowl that quickly morphed into utter confusion. My parents looked up, and I watched the blood drain directly from my mother's face. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody at the table moved a single muscle. They just stared at the woman they had thrown away 7 years ago. Trevor was the first to recover. He leaned back in his chair, draped his arm over Jasmine's shoulders, and let out a condescending chuckle. He looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit and expensive jewelry, but his deeply ingrained arrogance refused to let him see the reality of the situation. "Well, look who decided to finally show her face," he said, his tone dripping with thick superiority. "Nia, right. Are you still doing that little public relations gig up in New York? You know, if things are getting too tough for you up there, my firm is actually hiring. My receptionist just put in her 2 weeks' notice. The pay is minimum wage, but I am sure it is a step up for you." My parents immediately found their courage hidden behind his aggressive disrespect. My mother, Denise, slammed her teacup down onto the saucer. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here after what you did to this family," she hissed, leaning across the table. "You probably spent every last dime you have renting that car and buying that suit just to come down here and pretend you are doing well. We are not giving you a handout, Nia." My father, Marcus, scoffed and shook his head. "Your sister is about to be named vice president of her firm," he declared proudly. "She and Trevor are building an empire. You ran away from your responsibilities, and now you have nothing. Do not think you can come crawling back into our lives now that Jasmine is rich and successful." Jasmine finally found her voice. She adjusted her stolen designer bag and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "It is actually kind of sad, Nia," she sneered. "You completely missed out. Trevor and I just bought our 3rd investment property. We are untouchable in this city. You should have just stayed in your room and watched the kids like a good sister. Maybe then we would have let you live in our pool house." I stood there, letting their toxic delusions wash over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I did not tell them that my net worth was easily 50 times greater than the fake wealth they were currently drowning in. Instead, I calmly looked down at my diamond watch and then looked directly into Trevor's eyes. The quiet confidence in my gaze made his condescending smile falter just a fraction. "I am not here for a handout," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "I just stopped by for a cup of coffee. I wanted to see the happy couple one last time before the storm hits." Trevor narrowed his eyes, visibly irritated that I was not cowering before him. "What storm are you talking about?" he demanded, gripping the edge of the table. I gave him a slow, chilling smile. I leaned in slightly, resting my hands on the back of an empty chair. "Enjoy your celebration," I whispered softly. "Oh, and Trevor, Jasmine, I would strongly suggest you get your affairs in order. I hear the internal audit happening at your firm next Tuesday is going to be incredibly thorough. The federal investigators do not look kindly on wire fraud." The reaction was instantaneous. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from Trevor's face, replaced by a sudden sickening panic. Jasmine blinked in rapid confusion, completely unaware of the massive financial crimes her husband had committed using her department. My parents just looked bewildered, unable to comprehend what I had just said. Before any of them could utter another word, I turned around and walked out of the cafe. I climbed back into the waiting Maybach and instructed the driver to take me to my luxury hotel. The trap was set and the countdown had officially begun. The very next morning, the shockwave hit Atlanta with the force of a massive earthquake. At exactly 8 in the morning, Jasmine walked into the glass lobby of her financial firm, expecting to be greeted as the new vice president. Instead, she was met by a team of grim-faced security guards and a squad of external auditors. Her keycard was immediately deactivated. The firm's corporate board had initiated a total asset freeze on her entire department. All executive operations were completely suspended pending a hostile restructuring by an outside firm. Across town, Trevor was experiencing his own personal nightmare. The venture capital fund he managed was suddenly locked down. The banking executives had discovered the missing $5 million. Trevor's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from panicked investors and angry board members. He tried to transfer money out of his hidden offshore accounts to cover his tracks, but the accounts had already been frozen by the authorities. His entire web of lies was unraveling in real time. Jasmine locked herself in a glass conference room, her hands shaking violently as she called her husband. Trevor answered on the first ring, his voice completely hysterical. He demanded to know what was happening at her office. Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably, telling him that external auditors were seizing her computers and demanding access to the wire transfers she had approved for his company. She asked him why the board was freezing her assets and what the auditors meant when they mentioned corporate embezzlement. Trevor did not have an answer. He was too busy shredding documents in his own office, trying desperately to save himself. He told Jasmine to stay quiet, to deny everything, and to wait for the crisis management team the board had hired to arrive. The board of directors had sent out a company-wide memo that morning, announcing that a ruthless task force from New York City was flying in to take complete control of the company and terminate the guilty parties. Jasmine sat in that cold conference room, entirely unaware that her perfectly curated life was over. She genuinely believed that she could charm the incoming New York executives. She thought her parents could bail her out, or that Trevor's white privilege and wealthy connections would somehow shield them from the incoming destruction. She had absolutely no idea that the ruthless corporate crisis manager she was waiting for was the exact same sister she had mocked and humiliated just 24 hours ago. The glass doors of the executive boardroom on the 50th floor slid open, and the heavy silence of the room wrapped around me. Jasmine walked in first, flanked by Trevor and our parents. My mother and father had been urgently summoned by the corporate board under the guise of an emergency stakeholder meeting. They had leveraged their own personal assets to secure some of Trevor's initial business loans years ago, so they were legally required to be there. They walked into the room, radiating a bizarre mix of anxiety and misplaced arrogance. My parents genuinely believed they were walking into a rescue operation where Trevor would magically negotiate a buyout, and Jasmine would somehow emerge as the newly minted savior of the company. I was sitting at the far end of the massive mahogany table, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Atlanta skyline. My high-backed leather chair was turned completely away from them. I listened to the sound of their footsteps echoing against the polished floor. Trevor was already barking orders at the junior associates in the room, demanding to see the New York crisis manager immediately. He was dripping with that same unearned privilege he had wielded like a weapon his entire life. He slammed his expensive briefcase onto the table and loudly announced that his time was valuable and he would not be kept waiting by some overpaid corporate cleanup crew. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, set the glass down, and spun my chair around. The moment my face came into view, the entire room stopped breathing. Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward until her back hit the glass wall. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth. My mother Denise dropped her designer purse straight onto the floor. My father Marcus just stared, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he was looking at a ghost. Trevor, however, turned bright red. His shock instantly morphed into furious indignation. He slammed both hands flat against the mahogany table and leaned forward. He demanded to know what the hell I was doing sitting in the chief executive chair. He yelled that this was a restricted corporate lockdown and threatened to have me dragged out by security for trespassing. Before he could reach for the phone on the table, my executive assistant walked through the side door carrying a towering stack of heavily redacted financial files. She set them down directly in front of me and looked at my family with absolute ice in her eyes. She introduced me to the room with perfect professional clarity. She announced that I was the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Vanguard and the newly appointed majority voting shareholder of their entire financial group. She stated that as of 8 o'clock this morning, I had absolute legal authority over every single asset, employee, and executive decision in the building. The color rapidly drained from Trevor's face. He looked from my assistant to the files and then finally to me. The reality of the power dynamic was crashing down on him, but his ego simply refused to accept it. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted that this was an illegal conflict of interest. He accused me of staging a personal vendetta and threatened to tie my company up in federal litigation for decades. He told me I had absolutely no right to interfere with his venture capital fund. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table and folded my hands together. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not shout. I slid the thickest audit file across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of him. I told him he lost the right to dictate legal terms the moment he created 3 offshore shell companies to funnel $5 million of stolen corporate capital out of his investors' pockets. Trevor froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. My parents looked at him in total horror, finally realizing that their golden son-in-law was not a financial genius. He was a white-collar criminal. I opened my copy of the file and began reading the charges aloud. I detailed the exact dates, amounts, and routing numbers he used to siphon the money. I explained how he had deliberately exploited the corporate communications department to bury the financial discrepancies and issue false press releases to the shareholders. I looked directly at Jasmine, who was now hyperventilating against the wall. I laid out exactly how she had blindly signed off on every single fraudulent wire transfer because she was too obsessed with her title and her status to actually do her job. My mother Denise suddenly lunged forward, placing her hands on the table. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through her delusion. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. She begged me to stop the audit. She told me that Trevor could pay the money back if we just gave him time. She ordered me to protect my sister and erase the files. She actually used the exact same words she had weaponized against me 7 years ago. She said Jasmine must be protected, and that family comes first. She demanded that I use my power to sweep this under the rug and save Jasmine's reputation. I looked at my mother and let out a soft, chilling laugh. I reminded her of the morning she locked me in my bedroom. I reminded her how she told me my career was a joke, and that my only purpose in life was to be a stepping stone for Jasmine's perfect marriage. I stood up from the executive chair and walked around the table until I was standing mere inches from my sister. Jasmine was crying hysterically, pleading with me to save her job and her lifestyle. I looked down at her and delivered the verdict. I told her that mother was right. I told her I was finally prioritizing her. I announced that as the controlling shareholder, my very first executive action was prioritizing the removal of corporate liabilities. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and officially fired her for gross negligence and complicity in financial fraud. I told her she was stripped of all titles, benefits, and severance packages, effective immediately. Jasmine collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while Trevor paced the room like a caged animal, realizing his privilege could not save him from a paper trail this bloody. But the execution was not over yet. I had one final piece of business to conduct. The piece that would ensure they could never rebuild their toxic empire ever again. Landing in New York was a brutal awakening. I had walked into that towering glass building in Manhattan, wearing my torn suit skirt carefully pinned together, and delivered the interview of a lifetime. I secured the position as a junior communications specialist. It was the exact opportunity I had sacrificed my relationship with my family to get. But the harsh reality of living in one of the most expensive cities on the planet quickly stripped away any glamorous illusions I had. The starting salary at the firm was barely enough to cover a monthly Metro card and a closet-sized room. I rented a cramped, windowless space in a decaying apartment building in Queens, sharing one tiny bathroom with 4 other strangers. The heating constantly broke, leaving me to shiver through the bitter New York winter. To survive, I had to take on 3 separate jobs. My day started before the sun even came up. I worked my demanding corporate role from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, fetching coffee, organizing press files, and absorbing every single detail about how massive corporations operated. The moment my shift ended, I sprinted to the subway. I rode the train to a greasy 24-hour diner, where I tied an apron over my professional clothes and waitressed until midnight. I dealt with rude customers, wiped down sticky tables, and counted my tips just to afford my weekly groceries. On weekends, I did freelance data entry and ghostwriting for pennies, just to ensure I would never have to crawl back to Atlanta and beg for forgiveness. My entire existence became a relentless cycle of exhaustion. I operated on 3 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline. The physical toll was excruciating. My feet were perpetually covered in blisters from standing all day and night. The bags under my eyes became permanent fixtures. But I refused to break. I refused to let my parents be right about me. One particular night perfectly encapsulated the glaring divide between my new reality and the toxic world I had left behind. It was 3 in the morning. I was sitting on my thin mattress wrapped in a scratchy blanket, trying to ward off the freezing draft coming through the baseboards. I was eating a cup of instant ramen noodles because it was the only meal I could afford that week. My laptop rested on my knees as I typed furiously, working on a comprehensive market analysis report that my boss demanded by sunrise. I was exhausted to my very core. My fingers cramped and my vision blurred from staring at the bright screen in the dark room. Suddenly, my phone lit up on the floor beside me. I had cut off direct contact with my family, but the algorithms of social media still pushed their public updates onto my feed through mutual connections. The screen flashed brightly, illuminating the dark, cramped walls of my bedroom. It was a photo tag from Jasmine. She had posted a high-definition album from her luxury vacation in Aspen. The very same vacation I had been expected to sacrifice my career for. I put down my cheap noodles and picked up the phone. I swiped through the images with cold detachment. There was Jasmine draped in designer winter gear holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She was sitting by a massive stone fireplace in a 5-star ski lodge, her husband Trevor beaming arrogantly beside her. The caption read, "Living my best life with the absolute best husband." But the comment section was what truly turned my blood to ice. My mother Denise had commented right at the top, "You are our greatest pride and joy, Jasmine. You deserve the world." My father Marcus followed right behind her, writing, "The perfect daughter building a perfect family. We are so incredibly proud of the woman you have become." There it was, the ultimate validation. They had always denied me, freely handed to my sister simply for existing and marrying a wealthy man. They were showering her with praise while I sat thousands of miles away, freezing and starving, because I dared to want a career of my own. They were drinking vintage champagne on a snowy mountain, while I ate dollar ramen in a windowless box in Queens. A weaker person might have shattered right there. A weaker person might have picked up the phone, called their mother, and begged to come home to the comfort of that sprawling house in Atlanta. But as I stared at those photos, I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, a deep burning fire ignited in my chest. I stared at Jasmine's smug smile and my parents' fawning comments, and I used them as absolute fuel. I set the phone face down on the floor and picked my laptop back up. I finished that market analysis report and made it the most aggressive, flawless piece of corporate strategy my firm had ever seen. I stopped treating my situation like a punishment and started treating it like a training ground. Every rude customer at the diner taught me patience and emotional control. Every grueling hour at the corporate firm taught me strategy and crisis management. While I filed press releases for failing companies, I started noticing the glaring mistakes these wealthy executives made. They were arrogant, just like Trevor. They thought their money made them invincible. I realized that the corporate world was full of people exactly like my family. Every hunger pang reminded me of exactly what I was fighting for. I was building my armor piece by piece in the shadows. They thought they had buried me by cutting me off. They had no idea they had actually planted a seed that was about to grow into an unstoppable corporate monster. The traditional corporate playbook was completely pathetic. I watched top-tier executives cower behind generic apology statements and charitable donations whenever they were caught in a massive scandal. My bosses at the communications firm were terrified of confrontation. They always played defense, trying to appease the media and beg for public forgiveness. But growing up in a house ruled by narcissists and manipulators taught me a very different lesson. Playing defense only makes you a target. You never apologize to a predator. You find their leverage, and you break it. I realized these billionaires did not need public relations. They needed a wartime consigliere. They needed someone who could think exactly like the toxic people trying to destroy them. I started testing my theories quietly in the shadows. My first real opportunity came during my second year in New York. A prominent tech executive was about to be ousted by his own board of directors over a leaked financial scandal. My firm was advising him to step down gracefully and surrender his equity to save face. I managed to get 10 minutes alone with him in an elevator. I told him stepping down was professional suicide, and that apologizing would only accelerate his demise. I offered him an alternative strategy outside of company hours. He was desperate enough and arrogant enough to agree. I did not write him an apology speech. Instead, I spent 48 straight hours digging into the financial histories of the board members trying to oust him. I used every investigative trick I had learned to follow their digital footprints. I discovered the lead board member was actively funneling company assets into a private real estate venture. I drafted a counter-narrative and handed the executive the exact documents he needed to blackmail the board into absolute submission. By Monday morning, the executive was not fired. The lead board member quietly resigned for personal reasons, and the scandal vanished from the news cycle. The executive wired me a private consulting fee that was triple my annual salary. That single wire transfer changed my entire trajectory. Word traveled fast among the ultra-wealthy. They talk behind closed doors in exclusive country clubs and private panic rooms. Suddenly, I was the name being whispered when things went horribly wrong. High-profile politicians, disgraced hedge fund managers, and desperate corporate titans started reaching out to me directly. They bypassed my employer entirely because they did not want polished press releases or media training. They wanted my specific brand of ruthless execution. They wanted someone who could make their problems disappear without a single trace. The day I officially quit my junior communications job was the day I stopped playing by other people's rules. I walked out of that firm, leaving behind the grueling hours and the pathetic salary. With the capital I had amassed from my private clients, I leased a sleek office space in downtown Manhattan. I walked into the local registry and officially incorporated my business. Apex Vanguard was born. It was not a public relations agency. We operated as a shadow firm specializing in extreme crisis management and aggressive corporate restructuring. I built my empire with deliberate, calculated precision. I did not hire traditional marketing graduates with soft communication degrees. I recruited aggressive corporate lawyers, former intelligence analysts, and ruthless financial auditors. I built a team of absolute sharks who understood that in the corporate world, empathy was a dangerous liability. We swallowed failing narratives and spit out dominant outcomes. If a client was facing an embezzlement charge, we did not just hide the money trail. We orchestrated a hostile takeover of the accusing company and buried the evidence deep in the acquisition paperwork. We were surgical, and we were completely merciless. Apex Vanguard thrived because I applied the very same psychological warfare my mother and father used on me, but I monetized it on a massive scale. My parents taught me how to identify a person's deepest insecurity and exploit it for leverage. They taught me how to control a narrative by speaking louder and acting faster than the victim. I took all that generational toxicity, all that manipulation and trauma, and I weaponized it against the elite. I became the absolute master of the corporate chessboard because I was no longer emotionally compromised. I viewed every single business transaction through a lens of absolute cold logic. The millions started rolling in. The rapid growth of Apex Vanguard was entirely unprecedented. Within 3 years, my small downtown office expanded into a multi-floor headquarters in a towering glass skyscraper. We were handling multi-billion-dollar mergers, mitigating international corporate disasters, and reshaping the financial landscape of the entire East Coast. My reputation preceded me in every boardroom I entered. They called me the crisis fixer to my face, but behind closed doors they called me something else. They called me terrifying, and I loved every single second of it. I had transformed the invisible, neglected girl from Atlanta into an untouchable force of nature. I had supreme wealth, absolute power, and total control over my own destiny. By the time I reached my 30th birthday, I was officially a self-made millionaire. The bank accounts that used to hover dangerously close to zero now held comfortable 8-figure balances. Apex Vanguard was no longer just a crisis management firm. We had evolved into an apex predator in the corporate ecosystem. We began aggressively acquiring smaller boutique public relations agencies and independent financial consulting firms. I dismantled their soft, outdated approaches and absorbed their high-net-worth clients into my own portfolio. If a competitor tried to undercut our pricing or steal a client, I did not waste time negotiating. I simply leveraged my capital to buy their parent company and fired their entire executive board on a Tuesday morning. I demanded absolute perfection and relentless dedication from my team. They delivered flawless results because I paid them better than anyone else on Wall Street, and because they knew I would never tolerate a single excuse. My entire physical presence transformed to match the ruthless nature of the business I had built. The timid girl who used to shrink into the background wearing ill-fitting clearance rack blazers was completely dead and buried. I hired an exclusive personal stylist and overhauled my entire wardrobe. I threw out anything that looked soft or compromising. I exclusively wore custom-tailored silk suits with razor-sharp shoulder pads that gave me a formidable silhouette. Deep emerald greens, rich crimsons, and stark monochromatic blacks became my signature colors. I walked into aggressive corporate boardrooms wearing heavy Cartier watches and designer stiletto heels that echoed against marble floors like a warning shot. I learned very quickly that in rooms dominated by old money and aggressive men, visual intimidation was half the battle. When I sat at the head of a conference table, my posture, my clothes, and my cold, unblinking stare commanded absolute submission before I even spoke a single word. My days were a heavily orchestrated symphony of high-stakes negotiations and corporate warfare. I operated from a sprawling corner office, enclosed in floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. The panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline was a daily reminder of exactly how high I had climbed from that muddy garden in Atlanta. One crisp Tuesday morning, I was standing by the window sipping a black espresso and reviewing our quarterly acquisition targets. The heavy mahogany doors to my office swung open. My lead intelligence director, Elena, walked in. Elena was a former forensic accountant for the federal government and the most relentless investigator on my payroll. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She knew I only cared about actionable data. Elena walked briskly across the Persian rug and dropped a thick black folder directly onto the center of my glass desk. It was marked highly confidential and sealed with the red tape our firm used for top-tier corporate espionage and priority acquisitions. She looked at me with a razor-sharp expression and told me I needed to review the contents immediately. Apex Vanguard maintained a highly sophisticated surveillance network that constantly monitored failing investment funds and vulnerable corporate entities across the country. We looked for bleeding companies that we could either save for a massive fee or completely dismantle for profit. I set my espresso down, walked over to my desk, and opened the heavy folder. The first page contained a comprehensive financial breakdown of a major venture capital fund based in the Southeast. More specifically, it was based in Atlanta. I scanned the densely packed spreadsheets and forensic audit summaries. The numbers painted a catastrophic and highly illegal picture. This venture capital fund was hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented rate. But it was not due to market volatility or bad investments. It was a textbook case of massive internal fraud. Someone at the executive level was systematically siphoning millions of dollars into untraceable offshore shell companies. I flipped to the second page to see the executive hierarchy of the failing fund. My eyes locked onto the name of the vice president, who was actively orchestrating this massive financial crime. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The name printed in bold black ink was Trevor, my arrogant, untouchable white brother-in-law. The man who had mocked my career, called my dreams foolish, and helped lock me in a bedroom 7 years ago, was currently committing federal wire fraud. I turned to the next page, and the web of corruption grew even thicker. The report detailed exactly how he was covering his tracks, and the information was pure gold. Trevor could not hide $5 million entirely on his own. He was arrogant, but he was not a criminal mastermind. To successfully siphon that amount of capital out of his venture fund, he needed a corporate smokescreen. He needed a way to mask the missing millions as legitimate business expenses. The intelligence report detailed exactly how he accomplished this. His venture capital fund was closely partnered with a prominent financial corporation in Atlanta. Trevor used this partnership to push through dozens of fraudulent invoices categorizing the stolen money as high-tier media buys, consulting retainers, and massive public relations campaigns. He washed the stolen capital directly through their corporate communications department, where it was processed and paid out without a single question asked. And the newly appointed director of communications at that partnered financial corporation was my beautiful, spoiled, and utterly incompetent sister Jasmine. The forensic audit showed her digital signature on every single one of those fraudulent approval forms. Jasmine had been blindly rubber-stamping Trevor's illegal wire transfers for over 6 months. She was so obsessed with showing off her impressive executive title on social media, so busy planning her next extravagant vacation and curating her perfect online image, that she never bothered to actually read the financial documents she was authorizing. She saw a request from her wealthy white husband, and she simply approved it to maintain the illusion of their corporate power couple status. She was his perfect, clueless accomplice. But paper trails in the financial sector never truly disappear. The board of directors at Jasmine's corporation had recently hired an aggressive internal auditor who flagged the massive financial discrepancies. The board was now in a state of absolute terror. They knew that if the federal authorities or the Securities and Exchange Commission caught wind of a $5 million black hole tied to fraudulent wire transfers, their entire corporation would face devastating federal indictments. The board needed to contain the blast radius immediately and quietly. They needed a ruthless external firm to come in, freeze all assets, isolate the guilty executives, and restructure the corporate hierarchy before the government broke down their glass doors. In their desperate bid to survive, the board of directors did not look for local help in Atlanta. They wanted the most aggressive, untouchable crisis management firm on the East Coast. They sent a frantic, highly confidential proposal directly to Apex Vanguard. Elena stood silently in front of my desk, watching my eyes scan the final page of the corporate proposal. The board in Atlanta was offering my company a massive 8-figure consulting fee, but more importantly, they were offering a controlling voting share in their financial group in exchange for our immediate intervention. They were essentially handing over the keys to their entire empire, begging my firm to save them from the criminal disaster my own brother-in-law had created. I traced my manicured finger over the names printed on the audit report. Trevor and Jasmine, the two people who had laughed in my face while they locked me in a bedroom 7 years ago. The two people my parents worshipped as the absolute pinnacle of success and social grace. They had built their lavish, arrogant lifestyle on a fragile foundation of stolen money and profound stupidity. And now, by pure poetic coincidence, they had unwittingly handed me the detonator to blow their entire fake reality to pieces. A cold electric thrill coursed through my veins. This was no longer just another lucrative business acquisition. This was absolute surgical justice. I looked up at Elena. She knew the calculating look on my face and asked if we were taking the contract. I reached into my top desk drawer and pulled out my heavy gold fountain pen. I flipped to the final signature page of the acquisition agreement. With a perfectly steady hand and a heartbeat pulsing with pure adrenaline, I signed my name on the dotted line. By executing that single signature, Apex Vanguard officially became the majority shareholder and the supreme governing authority over the financial corporation that employed my sister. As of that exact second, I practically owned her entire professional existence. I handed the signed contract back to Elena and gave her strict immediate orders. I instructed her to initiate the hostile takeover protocols without a shred of hesitation. I told her to contact the bank and freeze all departmental assets under Jasmine's control. I also ordered our legal team to draft the termination papers for the executive communications department. Then I pressed the silver button on my desk intercom system. My executive assistant answered immediately, her voice crisp and professional. I told her to clear my entire schedule for the next 3 days. I instructed her to have the flight crew prepare the company private jet for an immediate departure. When she asked for our destination, I could not help the slow, predatory smile that spread across my face. I told her we were going to Atlanta. It was finally time to go home and collect my debts. The flight to Atlanta was swift. I sat in the plush leather seat of my private jet watching the clouds part as we descended into the city that had once been my prison. My intelligence team had already mapped out my family's exact schedule. They were creatures of deeply ingrained, arrogant habits. Every Friday afternoon, they gathered at an exclusive, ultra-expensive cafe in the heart of Buckhead. It was a place designed entirely for new money to loudly broadcast their supposed wealth over overpriced imported tea and delicate pastries. I stepped off the jet and into the back of a waiting black Maybach that my assistant had secured. I tapped the privacy glass and handed the driver the address. As we navigated through the familiar streets, the heavy southern heat pressed against the tinted windows, but inside the car, the air conditioning was ice cold, perfectly matching my current state of mind. I was wearing a pristine white custom-tailored silk suit that cost more than my parents' first mortgage, paired with towering designer stilettos and a heavy diamond Cartier watch. I wanted to look like absolute untouchable power. The Maybach glided to a smooth halt in front of the cafe. The valet drivers instantly scrambled over each other to open my door, their eyes widening at the sheer presence of the vehicle. I stepped out onto the sunlit pavement, adjusted my blazer, and walked through the heavy glass doors. The interior of the cafe was a masterclass in pretentious luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, and the ambient sound of clinking fine china mixed with soft jazz. I did not need to search for long. My family was seated at a premium corner table, perfectly positioned so everyone in the room could see them. I walked slowly toward them, letting the rhythmic clicking of my heels echo against the polished marble floor. As I approached, I could hear their loud, arrogant conversation bleeding through the ambient noise of the restaurant. They were in the middle of a massive celebration. Jasmine was sitting there draped in flashy designer logos, holding a limited edition luxury handbag that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased with the stolen corporate funds Trevor had funneled through her department. She was beaming, waving her manicured hand as she spoke. "The board is officially announcing my promotion to vice president next week." Jasmine bragged, her voice pitched high enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Trevor is helping me pick out the new furniture for my corner office. It has to be perfect." Trevor sat beside her, looking incredibly smug. He swirled his iced drink and leaned back in his chair with the unearned confidence of a man who thought he was completely invincible. "It is only fitting," Trevor declared loudly. "My venture capital fund just broke another record quarter. Between my investments and your new VP title, we practically own the financial sector in this city. We are building an empire." My parents. Marcus and Denise were leaning across the table, hanging on to his every word, as if he were a visionary prophet. My mother reached out and affectionately patted Jasmine's hand. "We are just so incredibly proud of you both," Denise gushed, her face glowing with intense validation. "You two are the absolute pinnacle of success. You represent the very best of this family." My father, Marcus, nodded vigorously in agreement, puffing out his chest. "You have elevated our entire social standing. You are the perfect power couple. Everyone at the country club is talking about your promotion, Jasmine." They were drowning in their own toxic delusions, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was already caving in. Their entire empire was a crumbling house of cards built on federal wire fraud and staggering incompetence. I stopped walking when I was exactly 5 feet away from their table. I stood there perfectly still, radiating silent authority, and waited for them to notice the executioner standing in their presence. Jasmine was the first one to see me. She had been in the middle of taking a sip from her delicate teacup when her eyes locked onto mine. The obnoxious laughter instantly died in her throat. The teacup rattled violently against its saucer as her hands began to shake. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and her jaw went slack. She nudged Trevor, frantically tapping his arm to get his attention. Trevor turned around with a deep scowl, ready to berate whoever was interrupting his moment of glory. But when he saw me, his arrogant expression morphed into utter confusion. My parents followed his gaze. I watched the blood drain directly and completely from my mother's face. The healthy flush of pride she had just been wearing vanished, replaced by a sickly pale shade of genuine horror. My father simply stared, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if a ghost had just materialized in the middle of the luxury cafe. For a long, terrifying moment, nobody at the table moved a single muscle. The clinking of the china and the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to fade away, leaving only the suffocating tension radiating from their table. They just stared at the woman they had cruelly thrown away 7 years ago. The daughter they had locked in a bedroom and tried to sabotage. The sister they had mocked and belittled to elevate their own pathetic egos. They expected to see the broken, desperate girl who had fled Atlanta with a torn skirt and a crushed portfolio. Instead, they were looking at a polished, ruthless corporate titan who could destroy their entire existence with a single phone call. The silence stretched thick and heavy, wrapping around their table like a tightening noose. I did not break eye contact. I stood tall, my pristine white suit practically glowing under the cafe lights, and let the sheer terror of my unexpected return slowly sink into their bones. Trevor was the first to break the suffocating silence. He let out a sharp scoff, shaking his head, as if dispelling the initial shock of my arrival. His ingrained sense of superiority simply would not allow him to feel intimidated by me. He leaned back in his chair, draped his arm casually over the back of Jasmine's seat, and looked me up and down. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was taking in the immaculate tailoring of my silk suit, the blinding clarity of my Cartier watch, and the undeniable aura of wealth I projected. But his ego immediately rejected the truth. To a man like Trevor, a black woman he viewed as beneath him could never genuinely achieve this level of power. He convinced himself it was all an elaborate costume. "Well, look who finally decided to show her face," Trevor said. His voice was loud and dripping with thick condescension designed to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Nia Wright. I almost did not recognize you. Are you still working that little public relations gig up in New York?" I did not answer. I simply kept my eyes locked on his, waiting for him to dig his own grave. Trevor chuckled, taking my silence as submission. He took a slow sip of his iced drink, projecting total relaxation. "You know, if things are getting too tough for you up there, my firm is actually hiring. My receptionist just put in her 2 weeks' notice. The pay is minimum wage, but I am sure it would be a massive step up from whatever you are doing now. I could put in a good word for you since you are technically family." The sheer audacity of his offer was staggering, but it had the exact effect he desired on my parents. Emboldened by his arrogant display, my mother and father instantly snapped out of their paralyzed state. They found their courage hiding safely behind the shield of Trevor's unearned privilege. My mother Denise slammed her delicate teacup down onto its saucer, causing the porcelain to rattle sharply. "You have a massive amount of nerve showing up here after what you did to this family," she hissed, leaning across the table. Her eyes were narrowed with that familiar toxic disdain I remembered so well. "You probably spent every last dime you have renting that car and buying that fake designer suit just to come down here and pretend you are doing well. Well, let me make one thing perfectly clear. We are not giving you a handout, Nia. Do not even ask." My father, Marcus, scoffed and shook his head, looking at me as if I were a stain on the marble floor. "Your sister is about to be named vice president of her firm," he declared, his voice booming with misplaced pride. "She and Trevor are building a financial empire in this city. You ran away from your responsibilities, and now you have absolutely nothing to show for it. Do not think for a single second you can come crawling back into our lives now that Jasmine is rich and successful. We do not need your drama ruining her moment." Jasmine finally found her voice. She adjusted the strap of her luxury handbag, the one purchased with stolen investor funds, and gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. She leaned forward, mirroring her husband's arrogant posture. "It is actually kind of sad, Nia," she sneered, her voice coated in false sympathy. "You completely missed out. Trevor and I just bought our third investment property. We are untouchable in this city. You should have just stayed in your room and watched the kids like a good sister. Maybe then we would have let you live in our pool house." They sat there, a perfect portrait of shared delusion. They were completely united in their belief that they were the ultimate victors of this family narrative. Trevor smirked confidently, believing his status as a wealthy white finance executive made him a god among men. My parents beamed at him, desperate to maintain their proximity to his perceived power. And Jasmine basked in the glow of her stolen lifestyle, entirely convinced that her hollow corporate title made her vastly superior to the sister she had abused. A weaker person might have engaged. A less disciplined woman might have screamed at them, slammed her hands on the table, and desperately tried to convince them of her wealth. I could have pulled up my bank accounts. I could have listed the Fortune 500 companies I owned. I could have shattered their egos right then and there with a barrage of facts and figures. But I did absolutely none of that. In the corporate world of hostile takeovers, you never interrupt your opponent when they are making a fatal mistake. You let them talk. You let them expose their absolute maximum level of arrogance. You let them climb as high as they possibly can upon their pedestal of lies, because it guarantees that the impending fall will completely shatter them. So I stood there and I listened. I absorbed every toxic word, every condescending offer, and every pathetic insult. I watched the way Trevor's jaw clenched slightly, revealing the hidden stress of a man secretly drowning in debt. I noticed the slight tremor in Jasmine's hands, betraying her deep-seated insecurities. I looked at my parents, who had sold their souls to a criminal just to look good at a country club. I did not frown or glare. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an apex predator, observing a group of oblivious animals, grazing peacefully in a cage that had already been locked. I let the silence stretch out after Jasmine finished her insult, allowing my complete lack of intimidation to unsettle them. My unwavering composure began to heavily crack Trevor's confident facade. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly hyper-aware that his insults had failed to land. He had fired his best shots, and I was standing before him completely unscathed. I did not raise my voice to match my mother's shrill, defensive tone. I did not pull out my phone to show Jasmine the 9-figure balance sitting securely in my corporate accounts. I didn't even bother to verbally decline Trevor's insulting offer to work as his minimum wage receptionist. Engaging in a screaming match in the middle of a crowded luxury cafe would imply that their opinions still held weight. It would signal that I still craved their validation. Instead, I let the silence stretch for just a few seconds longer, wrapping around their table like a heavy, suffocating winter coat. Slowly and deliberately, I raised my left wrist. The diamonds on my Cartier timepiece caught the afternoon sun, sending fractured beams of light dancing across the pristine white tablecloth. I studied the face of the watch for a brief moment, acting as though this family reunion was nothing more than a minor, irritating scheduling conflict in my otherwise highly important day. The watch was a symbol, a physical manifestation of everything I had built, but more importantly, it represented the one thing they were rapidly running out of: time. I dropped my arm and looked directly into Trevor's eyes. I bypassed my parents entirely and ignored Jasmine's confused, expectant stare. I focused all my energy on the man who thought his white collar and unearned privilege made him an invincible god among men. "I am not here to ask for a handout," I said, my voice carrying the smooth, dangerous cadence of a seasoned corporate predator. "I just stopped by for a quick cup of coffee. I wanted to see the happy couple one last time before the storm hits. Trevor's brow furrowed. The arrogant, relaxed smirk completely melted off his face, replaced by a sudden and sharp wariness. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned a stark white. "What storm are you talking about?" he demanded. There was a slight tremor in his voice now. The forced relaxation was entirely gone, replaced by the primal instinct of a cornered animal realizing it had stepped into a trap. I gave him a slow, chilling smile. I leaned in just an inch, resting my manicured hands on the back of an empty chair, invading his personal space with absolute, unyielding authority. "Enjoy your little celebration while it lasts," I whispered softly, ensuring my voice was low enough that only the four of them could hear the pure venom in my words. "Oh, and Trevor, Jasmine, I would strongly suggest you get your legal affairs in order immediately. I hear the internal audit happening at your firm next Tuesday is going to be incredibly thorough, and federal investigators do not look kindly on wire fraud." The reaction was instantaneous and profound. It was as if I had dropped a live grenade directly onto their tiered tray of imported pastries. Trevor actually stopped breathing. His chest froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The words audit and wire fraud hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with imminent destruction. He knew exactly what he had done. He knew about the $5 million, the offshore shell companies, and the fake invoices. Hearing those specific crimes slip from the lips of the sister-in-law he had just brutally mocked sent him into a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. Jasmine blinked in rapid succession, her mind struggling to process the sudden violent shift in the atmosphere. She looked from me to her husband, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for him to put me back in my place with a clever insult. But Trevor was completely silent. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mind desperately trying to calculate how I could possibly know about the stolen millions. He looked at me not as an inferior relative but as a genuine, terrifying threat. My parents were equally bewildered. They had no idea about the embezzlement or the corporate cover-ups. They just saw their golden son-in-law, the man they believed was their ticket to high society, suddenly looking like a terrified criminal waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. I did not wait for Trevor to formulate a lie. I did not give Jasmine the chance to ask what I meant. I simply straightened my posture, smoothed an invisible wrinkle from my silk blazer, and turned my back on them. I walked away with the exact same measured, rhythmic pace I had used when I arrived. I did not look over my shoulder. I didn't need to. I could feel the absolute chaos erupting at that corner table. The valet rushed to hold the heavy glass door open for me. As I stepped out into the humid Atlanta air, I felt a profound sense of closure regarding my past. 7 years ago, I had run from this family in a torn skirt, terrified and broken. Today I was walking away in a custom suit, leaving them to drown in the consequences of their own arrogance. My driver opened the door to the waiting Maybach. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat and let the quiet hum of the engine wash over me. Through the tinted privacy glass, I allowed myself one final glance at the patio. Trevor was frantically dialing his phone, his face pale and slick with sweat. Jasmine was clutching his arm, visibly distressed, demanding answers he could not give her. My parents sat frozen in their seats, their perfect afternoon completely shattered by a few carefully chosen words. I tapped the partition glass and told my driver to take me back to my luxury hotel. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my briefcase and sent a single secure message to Elena, my intelligence director back in New York. The psychological warfare had been successfully executed. I had planted the seed of absolute terror in Trevor's mind, ensuring he would spend the entire weekend making panicked, irrational decisions that would only further incriminate him. He would try to move the money. He would try to delete the emails. And my team would be tracking every single keystroke. The countdown had officially begun. By Monday morning, their entire world would be reduced to ashes. At exactly 8 o'clock that Monday morning, the shockwave hit the financial district of Atlanta with the force of a massive, devastating earthquake. Jasmine pulled her luxury SUV into the executive parking garage of her corporate headquarters. She was wearing a brand new designer dress purchased over the weekend, with funds she blindly assumed were part of her upcoming vice presidential signing bonus. She grabbed her expensive handbag and walked toward the soaring glass doors of the lobby, expecting to be greeted by the usual chorus of congratulations from her subordinates. She fully anticipated seeing a floral arrangement and a bottle of champagne waiting on her desk to celebrate her new corporate title. Instead, she walked into a scene of absolute clinical chaos. The pristine marble lobby was swarming with unfamiliar people. A dozen grim-faced security contractors in dark suits were stationed at the elevators holding electronic clipboards. Alongside them, a squad of external forensic auditors was systematically moving through the ground floor offices, packing hard drives into secure evidence boxes. Jasmine frowned, annoyed by the disruption to her perfect morning. She marched up to the executive elevator bank and swiped her gold-tier access badge against the scanner. The machine emitted a harsh red light and a sharp denying buzz. She swiped it again, denied. Before she could demand an explanation from the front desk, two towering security guards stepped directly into her path. They did not address her by her new fabricated title. They simply asked her to confirm her name, and then instructed her to hand over her corporate phone, her building keys, and her company-issued laptop. Jasmine demanded to know who was in charge and threatened to have them fired instantly. The security guards did not even blink. They silently escorted her away from the executive elevators and led her into a transparent glass conference room on the ground floor, locking the door behind her. Through the glass walls, Jasmine watched the absolute destruction of her professional empire unfold in real time. The firm's corporate board had initiated a total asset freeze on her entire communications department. All executive operations were completely suspended. The internal audit had triggered an emergency mandate locking out the entire board of directors from accessing any financial routing systems. Jasmine was completely isolated, cut off from her emails, her staff, and her stolen budgets. Across town, Trevor was experiencing a suffocating claustrophobic nightmare of his own. He had spent the entire weekend locked in his home office, sweating through his expensive button-down shirts as he desperately tried to cover his tracks. He had furiously typed routing numbers, attempting to bounce the missing $5 million through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But every single transaction was blocked. My intelligence team had already flagged his accounts, throwing an impenetrable digital net over his stolen capital. Now sitting in his venture capital fund office, Trevor was surrounded by the physical evidence of his incoming doom. His desk phone was ringing off the hook with furious calls from panicked investors and terrified board members who had just been notified of the massive discrepancies. The banking executives who previously worshipped him had officially locked him out of his own trading platforms. The $5 million black hole was fully exposed to the light of day. Trevor was frantically shoving physical ledgers and printed emails into a heavy-duty paper shredder, the loud mechanical grinding noise filling the room. He was destroying evidence like a cornered animal, hoping the shredded paper would somehow save him from federal prison. His personal cell phone buzzed violently on his desk. It was Jasmine. She was calling from the glass conference room, her voice completely hysterical and pitched high with pure terror. She demanded to know what was happening. She was sobbing uncontrollably, telling him that external auditors were seizing her department computers and demanding immediate access to the wire transfers she had approved for his company. She asked him why her assets were frozen and what the auditors meant when they explicitly used the words corporate embezzlement. Trevor did not have an answer. He barked at her to shut up and lower her voice. He ordered her to stay absolutely quiet, to deny any knowledge of the invoices, and to blame the entire situation on a clerical error by her junior staff. He told her to wait for the crisis management team the board had hired to arrive and to let him handle the talking. But his voice was trembling, and the sheer panic in his tone only made Jasmine cry harder. Just as he hung up the phone, a company-wide email notification flashed across the screens of every single employee in the building. The board of directors had released an urgent corporate memo. The message announced that they had surrendered all controlling authority to an elite, aggressive corporate restructuring firm from New York. A special task force was currently landing in Atlanta to perform a hostile takeover, conduct a brutal cleanup of the executive suite, and terminate all guilty parties without severance or negotiation. Sitting alone in that cold glass conference room, Jasmine wiped the mascara from her cheeks and tried to steady her breathing. Her perfectly curated life was actively burning to the ground, but her deep-seated arrogance refused to let her fully comprehend the danger. She reached into her stolen designer handbag, pulled out a compact mirror, and carefully fixed her makeup. She smoothed down her expensive dress and practiced a charming, innocent smile. She genuinely believed that she could flirt, network, and manipulate her way out of federal fraud charges. She thought her parents could bail her out, or that Trevor's wealthy connections would shield them from this incoming New York task force. She sat there practicing her posture, entirely unaware that the ruthless corporate executioner she was waiting to meet was the exact same sister she had mocked and humiliated just 3 days ago. She had absolutely no idea that her execution had already been scheduled, and I was the one holding the axe. The heavy silence of the ground floor conference room was broken by the sharp click of the electronic lock. 2 security contractors in immaculate dark suits opened the glass door and gestured for Jasmine to step out. They did not speak a single word to her, They simply flanked her sides and escorted her toward the private executive elevator bank. Jasmine smoothed down the front of her designer dress, lifting her chin and attempting to project an air of untouchable confidence. She convinced herself that this was just a massive misunderstanding. She was the face of the company. She was the newly minted vice president. Whoever these New York corporate fixers were, they would surely recognize her value and apologize for the aggressive inconvenience. The elevator doors chimed and slid open on the 50th floor. The atmosphere up here was entirely different. It was freezing cold, the air conditioning cranked to an intimidating level designed to keep everyone alert and uncomfortable. As Jasmine stepped out into the expansive reception area, another elevator pinged to her left. Trevor walked out escorted by his own pair of silent security guards. He looked like a man who had just been dragged through a hurricane. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, and his expensive silk tie was loosened. A thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. Jasmine rushed over to him, her heels clicking rapidly against the polished marble floor. She grabbed his arm, her voice a frantic hushed whisper. She demanded to know what was going on, and why they were being treated like common criminals. Trevor roughly pulled his arm away, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He ordered her to keep her mouth shut and let him do the talking. His ingrained arrogance was battling violently with his rising panic. He told her these New York auditors were just trying to flex their muscles and that he would handle the negotiation. He firmly believed his privileged background and aggressive Wall Street demeanor would allow him to bully the crisis management team into a favorable settlement. Before Jasmine could ask another question, the main lobby doors swung open. My parents, Marcus and Denise, strolled into the tense, suffocating environment, looking like they were arriving at a country club gala. My mother was wearing a bright, celebratory outfit, complete with a statement pearl necklace and an oversized designer handbag. My father walked right beside her, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. They had been summoned by the corporate board that morning via a formal legal courier. Years ago, desperately wanting to be part of Trevor's elite financial world. My parents had blindly leveraged the equity of their own home to secure one of his initial business loans. Because their personal assets were legally tied to his failing venture fund, they were required to be present for any major corporate restructuring. But Trevor, desperate to maintain his flawless image until the very last second, had lied to them. He had called them on their way over and told them this meeting was simply a corporate formality to finalize Jasmine's promotion and sign a massive new investment bailout that would make them all richer than ever. My mother let out a loud, oblivious laugh that echoed terribly in the grim, silent reception area. She walked straight up to Jasmine and pulled her into a tight hug. She loudly congratulated her golden daughter, completely ignoring the stern security guards surrounding them. She turned to Trevor and patted his shoulder, praising him for bringing such wealthy investors to the table. She said she knew his financial genius would always elevate this family to the highest echelons of society. Trevor winced, looking physically sick. He forced a tight, artificial smile, nodding along while his eyes remained wide with terror. He did not have the courage to tell his adoring in-laws that they were not here to celebrate. He did not tell them that the investors they were about to meet were actually ruthless corporate executioners who had come to tear their empire down to the studs. A woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out from the main hallway. It was Elena, my lead intelligence director. She looked at the four of them with an expression of absolute chilling indifference. She held a digital tablet in one hand and did not bother introducing herself. She simply announced that the chief executive officer was ready to see them now. She turned on her heel and instructed them to follow her. The walk down the long, expansive corridor felt like a death march. The walls were made of soundproof glass, and inside every single office, forensic accountants were boxing up hard drives and shredding documents. Jasmine finally began to feel the heavy, undeniable weight of the situation. Her confident facade started to crack as she noticed the sheer scale of the corporate raid happening around her. My father, Marcus, oblivious to the grim reality, kept whispering to my mother about how impressive this new firm must be to command such a massive operation. Elena stopped in front of the heavy double mahogany doors of the primary executive boardroom. She pushed them open and stepped aside, gesturing for the family to enter. The boardroom was an intimidating cavern of power and wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. A massive polished glass conference table stretched across the center of the room. Standing along the walls were four of the most ruthless, sharp-suited corporate lawyers in New York City. They stood perfectly still, their hands folded in front of them, projecting an aura of absolute legal menace. The temperature in the room was bone-chilling, but all the gravity of the room was anchored to the far end of the glass table. Sitting in the high-backed black leather executive chair was the CEO. The chair was turned completely away from the door, facing the expansive windows. The figure sitting in it was perfectly still, projecting a silent, overwhelming authority that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Trevor stepped into the boardroom first, puffing out his chest and attempting to summon every ounce of his unearned privilege. He adjusted his suit jacket, cleared his throat loudly, and marched toward the glass table. He demanded that the CEO turn around and address him face to face. He barked that his time was incredibly valuable, and he was not going to be subjected to theatrical corporate intimidation tactics. He loudly declared that he was a senior vice president, and he demanded immediate respect. Jasmine followed right behind him, flanked by my oblivious parents. My mother Denise actually smiled at the formidable lawyers standing against the wall, whispering to my father that these must be the new partners Trevor brought in to facilitate Jasmine's promotion. She clutched her designer purse and looked eagerly toward the back of the leather chair, waiting to charm the wealthy New York executive who was supposedly going to make her daughter a star. They stood there at the edge of the glass table, a perfect portrait of arrogance, delusion, and desperate privilege. They were entirely ready to demand their place at the top of the corporate food chain. They had absolutely no idea that the predator sitting in the chair had specifically designed this room to be their slaughterhouse. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then I pressed the tips of my tailored shoes against the floor and slowly pushed. The heavy leather executive chair began to rotate. The mechanical swivel was completely silent, but the movement seemed to deafen the entire room. I did not rush. I let the anticipation stretch until it was almost physically painful. As my face finally came into view, the atmosphere in the boardroom instantly shattered. I was sitting perfectly straight, with my hands resting lightly on the armrests. I wore my emerald green silk suit, and my expression was a mask of absolute unyielding stone. Jasmine was the first to react. The breath rushed out of her lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the plush carpet, until her shoulder slammed hard against the soundproof glass wall. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to cover her mouth to stifle a scream. My mother Denise suffered a similar fate. The eager, ingratiating smile she had prepared for the wealthy New York investors completely melted off her face. Her grip loosened, and her oversized designer handbag slipped from her fingers. It crashed onto the floor, sending her expensive cosmetics and keys spilling across the marble. The clatter echoed through the room like a gunshot, but no one moved to pick it up. My father Marcus stood frozen. His chest, which had been puffed out just seconds ago, immediately deflated. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring at me, as if a ghost had just materialized behind the most powerful desk in the building. Trevor, however, had a very different reaction. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He stared at me with pure horror, realizing that the crisis management team called in to investigate his massive financial crimes was not a room full of strangers he could manipulate. It was me. But as the initial shock subsided, his deeply ingrained privilege and toxic arrogance fought their way to the surface in a desperate bid for survival. His face flushed a violent shade of red. Trevor slammed both of his hands flat against the thick glass of the conference table. The loud smack startled my parents, but the 4 corporate lawyers lining the walls did not even flinch. He leaned forward, spitting his words with furious indignation. He demanded to know what the hell I was doing sitting in the chief executive chair. He yelled that this was a restricted corporate lockdown and threatened to have me dragged out by security for trespassing. He turned his wild eyes toward the lawyers and demanded they remove this crazy woman from the building immediately. He barked that this was a professional environment and he would not tolerate a pathetic family prank while millions of dollars were on the line. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not even blink. I simply sat there in total silence and watched him unravel. It was a pathetic display of a man who realized his power was nothing more than an illusion. Before, Trevor could reach for the conference phone in the center of the table to call security, my lead intelligence director. Elena stepped forward from the shadows of the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor, commanding instant attention. She carried a towering stack of heavily redacted financial files and slammed them down directly in front of my seat. The heavy thud silenced Trevor instantly. Elena looked at my family with absolute ice in her eyes. She did not raise her voice, but her words cut through the room like a scalpel. "You will lower your voice and step back from the table," she instructed Trevor coldly. "Allow me to introduce you to the room." She gestured toward me with a crisp, professional motion. "You are currently speaking to Ms. Nia. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard. Furthermore, as of 8 o'clock this morning, she is the newly appointed majority voting shareholder of this entire financial group. The room grew so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Elena paused, letting the staggering weight of those titles sink deep into their bones. Then she delivered the final crushing blow. She holds absolute legal authority over every single asset, every single employee, and every single executive decision in this building. You are standing in her boardroom. You are breathing her air. The psychological crushing weight of that reality pressed down on my family, completely obliterating their delusions of grandeur. The suffocation in the room was palpable. Jasmine began to shake uncontrollably, her hands clutching her stomach as she looked wildly around the room for an exit that did not exist. My mother looked from Elena to the intimidating lawyers and finally back to me. Her mind was desperately trying to bridge an impossible gap between the daughter she had thrown away and the corporate titan sitting before her holding the keys to their entire existence. My father braced himself against the wall, looking physically ill. Trevor shook his head wildly, violently rejecting reality. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted that this was an illegal conflict of interest. His voice cracked, revealing the raw terror hiding beneath his anger. He accused me of staging a personal vendetta and threatened to tie my company up in federal litigation for decades. He told me I had absolutely no right to interfere with his venture capital fund and that he would call the police to report corporate espionage. I finally moved. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass table and folded my hands together. I looked directly into Trevor's panicked eyes, piercing straight through his bravado. I told him he lost the right to dictate legal terms the moment he created 3 offshore shell companies to funnel $5 million of stolen corporate capital out of his investors' pockets. Trevor gasped, as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the room. He stared at me with wild eyes, but his deeply ingrained privilege refused to let him surrender without a fight. He had spent his entire life failing upward, protected by his background, his connections, and a society that handed him second chances on a silver platter. He desperately tried to summon that unearned authority one last time. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the glass. "You are completely out of your mind!" He spat, his voice shaking with a volatile mix of rage and terror. "I am a senior vice president of a Tier 1 venture capital fund. You cannot just march in here with fake documents and accuse me of a federal crime. My legal team will bury you so deep you will never see daylight again. You have absolutely no jurisdiction over my fund." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic shouting. I simply reached out and picked up the thickest black folder from the stack Elena had placed in front of me. I tossed it effortlessly across the slick glass table. It slid with a heavy, satisfying thud, stopping precisely inches from Trevor's trembling hands. "Open it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. When he refused to move, paralyzed by his own cowardice, I narrated the contents for him. Page 4. Trevor. A transfer of $1.2 million executed on October 14th, routed through a dummy consulting firm, registered in the Cayman Islands. Page 9. $2.8 million diverted from the employee pension acquisition budget, masked as a high-tier media buy. And my personal favorite, page 22. The exact internet protocol address logs showing you frantically trying to move those frozen funds from your home office at 3 o'clock this morning. Trevor stared at the closed folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some convoluted excuse about market volatility or aggressive restructuring strategies, but his voice completely failed him. The impenetrable shield of his background, the expensive private schools, the generational wealth, the societal assumption that a man who looked like him could never be a common thief was instantly pulverized by raw, undeniable data. "You thought you were invincible," I continued, rising slowly from the executive chair. I walked around the edge of the large table, my heels striking the marble floor with measured, predatory precision. "You thought you could walk into this city, siphon millions of dollars from hard-working investors, and use my sister's communications department to launder the stolen capital. You truly believe that because of who you are, no one would ever dare to look closely at your books. You thought your status made you bulletproof." I stopped walking and stood directly over him, looking down at the man who had once mocked my ambitions. "But you made one fatal miscalculation, Trevor. You left a digital paper trail so wide and so bloody that even a first-year accounting student could have caught you." Trevor stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a leather guest chair. He collapsed into it, running his hands frantically through his disheveled hair. The arrogant, condescending man who had laughed in my face and locked me in a bedroom 7 years ago was entirely gone. In his place sat a terrified, pathetic criminal who finally realized he was going to federal prison. He looked wildly at the four corporate lawyers standing along the wall, his eyes begging for some sort of professional courtesy, a secret handshake, an implicit understanding among men of status. But the lawyers simply stared back with absolute chilling apathy. They were my lawyers, and they smelled blood in the water. Trevor, Jasmine whispered, her voice cracking with pure terror. She rushed to his side, grabbing his shoulder with her shaking hands. Tell her she is lying. Tell them it is a mistake. You said the audit was just a formality. You said we were untouchable. Trevor could not even look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. My father. Marcus took a step forward. His hands shaking so violently, he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. Trevor, son, please tell me this is a misunderstanding. We leveraged the house for your initial seed capital. You told us the returns were guaranteed. You said our investment was safe. Cornered and desperate. Trevor's survival instinct kicked in. The facade of the perfect wealthy son-in-law completely shattered, and he immediately turned on the very people who had worshipped him. Shut up! He snarled at my father, his voice dripping with sudden venomous contempt. You ignorant old fool. You really thought I was going to make you rich. I used your equity to cover my margins because you were desperate enough to buy into my status. You handed me your money because you wanted to brag at your pathetic country club. Then he whipped his head toward Jasmine, batting her hand away as if her touch burned him. And you, he hissed, his face twisting in disgust. You were the perfect idiot. You signed every single fraudulent invoice I put on your desk without reading a single word, because you were too busy planning our next vacation and posting photos of your designer bags. You cared more about your fake vice president title than doing your actual job. You are just as guilty as I am. Jasmine let out a sharp, devastated wail, stepping back from him, as if she had been physically struck. The illusion of her perfect marriage dissolved into ashes right in front of her eyes. My parents stood paralyzed, forced to listen as the man they had chosen over their own daughter verbally decimated them. Trevor turned his frantic eyes back to me. His anger evaporated, replaced by a sickening, desperate need to save himself. He realized threats would not work, so he tried to bargain. Nia, listen to me, he stammered, raising his hands in a placating, pleading gesture. We can fix this. You are a crisis manager, right? That is what you do. You fix things. We can make a deal. I can restructure the debt. I have contacts. I can get the money back into the accounts before the federal authorities realize it is gone. Just give me 48 hours. We are family. You can take a percentage. You can take whatever you want. I looked down at him, my expression twisting into one of pure, absolute disgust. You are trying to bribe me with money that you do not even have, I said, my voice razor sharp, cutting through his pathetic pleas. You still do not understand the reality of your situation. I am not here to negotiate a settlement, Trevor. I am here to facilitate an execution. I leaned in closer, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. The moment I signed the acquisition paperwork for this firm, my legal team handed this exact audit file directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission. There is no cover-up. There is no grace period. You are not going to call your wealthy friends to bail you out. Your venture capital fund is dead, your reputation is completely decimated, and your future involves a highly publicized federal indictment. Trevor let out a choked, hollow sound and buried his face in his hands. He was utterly broken, stripped of his wealth, his freedom, and his pride. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my silk blazer, and turned my attention away from the ruined man in the chair. It was time to deal with the person who had blindly facilitated his crimes. I slowly shifted my gaze to my sister, who was sobbing uncontrollably against the glass wall. My mother, Denise, suddenly lunged forward. The absolute shock that had paralyzed her for the last 10 minutes finally shattered, replaced by the fierce, irrational instinct to protect her golden child. She pushed past my father and stepped directly into my line of sight, physically shielding Jasmine with her own body. Her face was flushed with a desperate, frantic energy. You have to stop this, Denise demanded, her voice trembling but rising in volume. She pointed a shaking finger at the thick audit files resting on the glass table. You are the CEO. You own this company now. You can make this all go away. You can delete those files and shred those reports right now. Trevor made a mistake, but Jasmine had nothing to do with it. She is your sister. I looked at my mother, completely unbothered by her frantic demands. Jasmine signed every single fraudulent wire transfer. She authorized the movement of stolen capital. Ignorance of the law does not grant you immunity from it. She did not know what she was signing, Denise shrieked, slamming her hand against the back of an empty leather chair. She trusted her husband. You cannot let her take the fall for this. You have the power to bury this investigation. Family protects family. Jasmine comes first. She has always come first, and you will protect her right now. The words hung in the freezing air of the boardroom. Jasmine comes first. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. I let her exact words echo against the soundproof glass walls. And then I laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was a dark, chilling, hollow laugh that sent a visible shiver down my father's spine. I stood up from my executive chair and slowly walked around the massive mahogany table. My heels clicked against the polished floor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. I did not stop until I was standing less than 2 feet away from my mother. Jasmine comes first, I repeated, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. That is exactly what you told me 7 years ago. Do you remember that morning, Mother? Do you remember standing in the doorway of my bedroom, blocking my only exit while you tossed screaming toddlers onto my professional portfolio? Denise swallowed hard, stepping back as I advanced. You told me my career was a joke. I continued, my gaze locking her in place. You told me my only purpose in life was to be a stepping stone to protect Jasmine's perfect marriage. You demanded that I sacrifice my entire future just so she could go drink champagne on a mountain. You threw me away like garbage because you thought Trevor was your golden ticket to elite society. I shifted my attention to Jasmine, who was cowering behind my mother, sobbing uncontrollably. The heavy designer makeup she had so carefully applied that morning was now running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked absolutely pathetic. Nia, please, Jasmine begged, her voice cracking. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest. I did not know what I was doing. I just wanted to be successful. I just wanted everyone to be proud of me. You cannot let them send me to prison. I will lose everything. My friends, my house, my reputation. You wanted the title without the work, I stated coldly. You wanted the corner office and the corporate crown, but you refused to do the heavy lifting required to actually earn it. You were so utterly obsessed with curating a fake life on social media that you became the perfect clueless accomplice to a federal crime. I turned back to my mother, holding her gaze with absolute unyielding authority. But you are right about one thing, Mother. I am finally prioritizing my sister. As the head of this firm, it is my sworn fiduciary duty to prioritize the immediate removal of all toxic corporate liabilities, I signaled to Elena. My intelligence director stepped forward with crisp military precision and handed me a single sheet of paper printed on heavy watermarked corporate letterhead. I held the document up so Jasmine could clearly see the bold red termination stamp at the top. Jasmine. I announced, my voice ringing out with the absolute unquestionable power of a corporate executioner. As the chief executive officer and the controlling voting shareholder of this financial group, I am officially terminating your employment effective immediately. You are fired for gross negligence, severe breach of fiduciary duty, and active complicity in federal wire fraud. Jasmine let out a sharp, devastated wail. She crumpled to the floor, her knees hitting the expensive carpet as she buried her face in her hands. I did not flinch. I read the rest of the terms with the surgical precision of a machine. You will receive no severance package. Your corporate stock options are permanently voided. Your executive health benefits are canceled as of this exact second. You are no longer the vice president. You are a civilian and you are a massive legal liability to my empire. My father, Marcus, finally broke his silence. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside his golden child, wrapping his arms around her shaking shoulders. He looked up at me with tears pooling in his eyes, his pride completely shattered. Nia, I am begging you, he pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. She will lose everything. Trevor has ruined us. We have nothing left to fall back on. Please have some mercy on your own blood. You drained the well of my mercy. 7 years ago, I replied, staring down at the pathetic scene unfolding on the floor of my boardroom. You chose your golden child and your wealthy white son-in-law over your own flesh and blood. You made your bed with stolen money and toxic arrogance. Now you get to sleep in it. I turned to the 2 security contractors waiting silently by the heavy mahogany doors. I gave them a sharp, definitive nod. Escort this former employee to the ground floor. She is not permitted to return to her office. She is not permitted to collect any personal belongings. Ensure she leaves the premises immediately. The guards stepped forward, their expressions completely blank, and grabbed Jasmine by the arms. They hauled her to her feet. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name, begging me to change my mind, begging our mother to do something. Denise lunged forward, trying to pull Jasmine away from the guards, but Elena smoothly stepped into her path, blocking her with an intimidating, impenetrable stance. Take your hands off her! Denise shrieked, her voice echoing wildly against the glass. You cannot do this! You are destroying our family. We will have nothing. I am not destroying anything, I said quietly, watching the guards drag my sister toward the elevator banks. I am simply sweeping up the trash that you actively encouraged her to leave behind. Trevor, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence this entire time, finally realized the absolute finality of the situation. His wife was gone. His job was gone. His fake empire had been burned to ashes in a matter of minutes. He looked at me, a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant man who had walked into this building just an hour ago. But the execution was not over. The corporate cleanup had only just begun. I had saved the most devastating, perfectly calculated blow for the very end. I walked back to my leather chair, sat down, and picked up the final folder, resting on my glass desk. It was time to sever the last remaining thread of their toxic delusion. I opened the sleek black folder resting in the exact center of my glass desk. The high-grade paper made a sharp, crisp sound as I turned to the final page. The boardroom was suffocatingly quiet. Trevor was still slumped in his guest chair, staring blankly at the polished marble floor. My father was holding my mother, who was trembling violently against his chest. They were waiting for me to dismiss them. They genuinely thought the worst was over. They thought watching Jasmine lose her corporate title and her stolen lifestyle was the ultimate penalty. They were entirely wrong. The corporate cleanup was just entering its final phase. I looked directly at Marcus and Denise. I asked them a very simple financial question. I asked them if they understood how venture capital seed funding actually worked. My father blinked, his eyes red and confused. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was completely out of his depth. I did not wait for his answer. I reminded them of the lavish dinner they had hosted 5 years ago, the one they had posted hundreds of photos of on social media. They had celebrated Trevor launching his independent fund, touting him as a financial genius. But the reality was that Trevor did not have liquid capital back then. His wealthy family had quietly cut him off because they knew exactly how reckless and incompetent he truly was. He needed a guarantor. He needed a massive line of credit to rent his office, hire his staff, and create the illusion of success. He needed someone foolish enough to underwrite his massive bank loans. He looked at the two of you, I said, my voice slicing through the silent room like a blade. Two people so utterly desperate for social validation, so hungry to be tied to a man of his perceived racial and economic status, that you did not even bother to read the fine print. You wanted to brag at your country club so badly that you handed him a blank check. I reached into the folder and pulled out a heavy stapled legal document. It was a master loan agreement and a deed of trust. The signatures at the bottom were instantly recognizable. You leveraged the entire equity of your sprawling 6-bedroom house. I continued, holding the document up so they could see their own handwriting. You signed away your sanctuary. The very same house where you locked me in a bedroom to protect his vacation. You put your entire life on the line to guarantee Trevor's toxic debts. You bet your entire existence on a man who despised you behind your backs. My mother let out a small, wounded gasp. She looked at Trevor, demanding that he tell me this was a lie. She begged him to assure her that their home was safe. Trevor did not even lift his head. He just pulled at his loose silk tie, completely defeated. I set the document down and explained the mechanics of high-level banking to them as if I were speaking to children. I told them that when the internal audit flagged Trevor's massive wire fraud last week, his primary lenders instantly panicked. Major banks absolutely despise criminal liability. They immediately categorized his entire portfolio as distressed toxic debt. And when banks want to quietly offload toxic debt before a federal investigation goes public, they sell it for pennies on the dollar to massive private equity firms. They sell it to firms exactly like Apex Vanguard. I watched the exact second the catastrophic math finally clicked in my father's head. His knees literally buckled beneath him. He had to grab the edge of the heavy glass conference table with both hands just to stop himself from collapsing onto the floor. His breathing became shallow and erratic. My mother looked at him frantically, shaking his arm and demanding to know what I meant. My father could barely speak. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. He choked on his words as he looked at my mother and told her that I owned their debt. I stood up from my chair and buttoned my emerald silk blazer. I corrected him. I told him I did not just own their debt. I explained that because Trevor had officially defaulted on the terms of the loan by committing federal fraud, the collateral was subject to immediate seizure. I own your house, I announced, the words ringing out with absolute terrifying finality. I own the walls, the roof, the front door, and the beautiful rose garden where I scraped my hands climbing out of a window 7 years ago. Every single brick of your perfect suburban illusion belongs entirely to me. I hold the deed to your entire life. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. My mother dropped to her knees right there in the middle of the boardroom. The woman who had spent my entire life obsessed with appearances, who had treated me like a stepping stone for her own vanity, was kneeling on the floor in front of me, weeping uncontrollably. She begged me not to take her home. She cried that she was too old to start over. She pleaded with me to remember that she was my mother and that blood had to mean something. My father could not even look at me. He stared at the legal document on the table, completely broken. The pride he had carried for decades, the arrogance that had allowed him to throw his own daughter away, was entirely pulverized. They were completely at my mercy. Their fate, their shelter, their entire future was resting in the palm of my hand. I looked down at the two people who had caused me so much pain. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a ledger that had finally been balanced, before my mother could utter another desperate plea. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent, authoritative force. The two security contractors stationed by the entrance immediately stepped aside, clearing the path for the real authorities. A team of 6 federal agents walked into the room. They moved with absolute synchronized precision. They wore dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission printed sharply across their backs. Silver badges gleamed against their chests, catching the cold light of the room. The corporate cleanup had officially transitioned into a federal criminal takedown. The lead agent, a tall, uncompromising man with a hardened expression, did not waste a single second on pleasantries. He walked straight past my kneeling mother and approached the glass conference table. He stopped directly behind Trevor's chair. Trevor did not try to run. He did not try to invoke his family name or his elite university pedigree. The sheer weight of the federal badges completely evaporated the last remaining fumes of his arrogance. He sat frozen in the guest chair, his eyes wide and vacant, watching his entire life shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The agent spoke with a loud, booming voice that commanded the entire room. He stated Trevor's full name and officially placed him under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. He instructed Trevor to stand up and place his hands behind his back. When Trevor could not command his legs to move, 2 agents stepped forward. They grabbed him by the shoulders, hauled him roughly to his feet, and twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the silent boardroom. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. The man who had mocked my minimum wage jobs, who had laughed at my career ambitions, and thought his skin color and bank account made him invincible, was now physically bound, like the common thief he truly was. The agents patted him down, emptying his pockets of his luxury wallet, his expensive car keys, and the corporate phone he had used to steal millions. As they marched, Trevor toward the exit. The boardroom doors remained wide open, revealing the expansive reception area outside. The timing was nothing short of cinematic perfection. The executive elevator chimed and the polished metal doors slid apart. Jasmine was standing inside, flanked by the security guards who had just escorted her downstairs. But they had not let her leave the building. They had been waiting for federal clearance. Jasmine stepped out of the elevator and froze. She saw the federal agents. She saw the bright yellow letters on their jackets. And then she saw her husband, the man who was supposed to buy her a mansion and elevate her to high society, being Frog marched down the marble hallway in steel handcuffs. A guttural, agonizing scream ripped from Jasmine's throat. It was not her usual theatrical crying. It was a raw, primal sound of absolute terror. She broke away from the security guards and lunged toward Trevor. "Trevor, tell them," she shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "Tell them it is a huge mistake. Tell them you have the money. Do not let them take you." Trevor did not even look at her. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as the agents pushed him forward. He walked right past his hysterical wife without speaking a single word, leaving her to face the catastrophic damage he had orchestrated. 2 female federal agents immediately stepped into Jasmine's path. They blocked her from reaching Trevor and calmly informed her that she was being detained for questioning regarding her role in the approval of fraudulent wire transfers. They did not handcuff her, but they took her by the arms and guided her toward a separate holding room. Jasmine fought against their grip, twisting her body and looking wildly around the corridor. Her eyes locked onto me as I stood in the doorway of the boardroom. The arrogant, spoiled golden child was completely gone. She was hyperventilating her designer dress, wrinkled, her expensive makeup smeared completely across her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Nia, please," she begged, sobbing so hard she could barely form the words. "Please do not let them take me. I am your sister. I will do anything. I will give the title back. I will give the money back. Just tell them to stop. You fix things, Nia. Fix this." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my emerald suit. I looked at her with the same cold, unflinching indifference she had shown me for 32 years. I told her that she should have read the documents before she signed them. I turned my back on her and walked into the boardroom, letting the heavy mahogany doors swing shut, cutting off the sound of her desperate, pathetic wails. Inside the room, the atmosphere was completely devastated. My mother Denise was still on the floor. She had witnessed the entire scene through the glass walls. She had watched her wealthy, privileged son-in-law get hauled away in chains. She had watched her golden, perfect daughter get detained by federal authorities. Her entire universe, built entirely on false prestige, social climbing, and toxic favoritism, had just been vaporized in a matter of minutes. Denise collapsed entirely. She fell forward, her hands pressing flat against the cold marble floor, and she began to hyperventilate. It was the very first time in her entire life she was tasting the bitter metallic flavor of absolute unconditional loss. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no one left to blame. There was no wealthy benefactor coming to save her. She had traded her own flesh and blood for a seat at a table that was funded by stolen money. And now she was left with absolutely nothing. My father, Marcus, slowly sank into a chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. He was crying quietly, the silent, defeated tears of a man who realized he had destroyed his own family for a mirage. They had absolutely no money, no home, no status, and no future. The country club friends they so desperately wanted to impress would be reading about their spectacular downfall in the Financial Times by tomorrow morning. They would be the ultimate social pariahs of Atlanta. I walked back to my desk and picked up my briefcase. The corporate takeover was officially complete. The criminals had been removed, the assets were frozen, and the toxic liabilities had been permanently neutralized. I had executed a flawless, brutal restructuring of both this financial corporation and my own family tree. I stood at the head of the conference table and snapped the golden clasps of my briefcase shut. The sharp metallic sound snapped my mother out of her shock-induced trance. She scrambled awkwardly from the marble floor, grabbing the hem of my emerald blazer with trembling hands. Her tear-streaked face was a portrait of absolute desperation. "Nia, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending homelessness. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take our home. Where will we go? We are your parents. We gave you life. You have made your point. You won. Just please let us keep the house." My father looked up from his hands, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. He weakly echoed her sentiments, begging me to show some shred of family loyalty, promising that things would be different now. He swore they had learned their lesson and pleaded with me not to throw them out onto the street at their age. I looked down at my mother's hands, desperately clutching my pristine silk blazer. I did not pull away immediately. I simply stared at her fingers until she realized the sheer boundary she was crossing, and slowly withdrew her hands, shrinking back in fear. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing out the fabric where she had touched me. I tilted my chin up, looking down at the two people who had once held absolute terrifying power over my life. The fear in their eyes was the exact same fear they had forced me to swallow when they locked me in that bedroom. "I do not negotiate with toxic assets," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "The deed belongs to Apex Vanguard now. The foreclosure process has already been legally initiated, and there is absolutely nothing your lawyers can do to stop it." I stepped past them, moving methodically toward the heavy mahogany doors. But before I crossed the threshold, I paused. I turned my head just slightly, casting one final chilling look over my shoulder at the ruined king and queen of their fake suburban castle. "You have exactly 30 days to pack up whatever cheap possessions you have left," I commanded, my words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. "Do not attempt to strip the fixtures or damage the property. My security team will be monitoring the premises 24/7. And when the 30th day arrives, I want you to remember one very specific instruction." My parents stared at me, holding their breath. "Do not walk out through the front door," I stated, my tone dripping with absolute finality. "You will pack your bags, and you will leave through the back door. You will exit through the dirt and the mud exactly how you forced me to leave 7 years ago." I turned my back on them and walked out of the boardroom. I strode down the executive corridor, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor, and I did not look back. Not even once. The scene transitioned smoothly from that cold corporate hallway back to the warm, ambient lighting of my penthouse in Atlanta. I am sitting exactly where I started this story, relaxing on my custom leather sofa, with the glittering city skyline stretched out endlessly behind me. I lift my crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip. The distant hum of the traffic far below feels like a victory march. Society constantly conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable, absolute bond. They preach that we must endlessly forgive every betrayal, absorb every insult, and willingly sacrifice our own potential just to keep the peace at a toxic family dinner table. But that is a dangerous lie designed to keep abusive cycles alive. Family is supposed to be a solid foundation of support, not a heavy anchor dragging you into the abyss of their own failures. When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to sell you out for their own superficial vanity, you have zero obligation to be their safety net. Cutting my family off was not an act of cruelty. It was the ultimate act of self-preservation. I stopped begging for a seat at a table that was built on lies, stolen money, and unearned privilege. I walked out into the dirt and built my own empire from the ground up. I realized that my worth was never determined by their approval. True, undeniable power comes from absolute independence. When you control your own narrative and you own your own capital, nobody can ever lock you in a room again. They expected me to remain the invisible submissive sister forever. Instead, I became the architect of their complete destruction. You have heard my story, now I want to hear yours. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member who tried to diminish your light? Have you ever had to walk away from a table where respect was no longer being served? Drop down into the comments below and share your experiences. Tell me how you broke free from the people who tried to hold you back. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe in unapologetically taking your power back. People always love to say that living well is the best revenge. But they are entirely wrong. The best revenge is not harboring anger. It is not screaming or crying or desperately trying to make a narcissist understand your pain. The best revenge is a blood-soaked financial report,